Hello and welcome to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. The war on drugs has been declared a failure. The U.S. government has spent more than $2.5 trillion fighting this campaign over the past 40 years, but the problem has only gotten worse and more deadly. Is it now time to seriously consider decriminalization and regulation of some illegal drugs? Crosstalk, what went so wrong fighting drugs, I'm joined by Jeffrey Myron in Newton. He is a senior lecturer and director of undergraduate studies in the Department of Economics at Harvard University. He's also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and he's also the author of the book Drug War Crimes, The Consequences of Prohibition. And in San Diego, we cross to Asa Hutchinson. He is a senior partner at the Asa Hutchinson Law Group. All right, gentlemen, this is Crosstalk, and that means Crosstalk rules in effect. But before, let's have a look at a short report about this 40-year-old war.
A worldwide enterprise worth some $400 billion a year, illegal drug trafficking has become one of the most ferociously lucrative businesses in the world, alongside only the oil industry and the arms trade. Its single largest market, the U.S., is also the world's biggest consumer of cocaine, heroin, and marijuana, shipped from Colombia and Mexico. And although the U.S. government has been hard-pressed to control and curtail the narcotics trade, drug-related violence has spread like wildfire across Latin America and especially Mexico.
Our insatiable demand for illegal drugs fuels the drug trade. Our inability to prevent weapons from being illegally smuggled across the border to arm these criminals causes the deaths of police officers, soldiers, and civilians.
Mexican officials have long been trying to draw attention to the torrent of illegal weapons flowing in from the U.S., which conveniently sustain drug cartels and crime that have seen more than 40,000 Mexicans killed in the last 5 years. And a recent report by the Global Commission on Drug Policy denounced the recalcitrant violence, calling the global war on drugs a failure.
Stop the war on drugs, and let's be more constructive in trying to reduce the consumption. If you look only after the production, the market is so profitable that all time will be someone which will be capable to risk his life to continue to be trafficked.
Indeed, profit margins related to the drug industry are huge and is the main factor that sustains it. And many argue that if some drugs were legalized, it would help put a cap on their price and a stop to the incessant violence, all the while purging the economy of a black market.
Making drugs more available, as this report suggests, will make it harder to keep our communities healthy and safe.
The fact that each dollar that an American spends on drugs goes to fuel a juggernaut of corruption and violence is no revelation. And neither is the fact that the U.S. war on drugs has not managed to keep that violence at bay, nor yield any substantial results. But whether or not legalization can provide an alternative that wouldn't open floodgates to an even larger problem remains to be seen, and so does the prospect of any other viable strategy. Masha Charney for Crosstalk RT.
Okay, gentlemen, I'd like to go to Jeffrey first. I'm sure both of you are aware of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and it's a pretty dismal report card after spending $2.5 trillion in fighting what's called a war on drugs. So, Jeffrey, just what went wrong? Give me your priority list. What was this? What needs to be fixed first?
Well, I think the first thing that went wrong was thinking of the whole policy issue as a war, and in particular a war on drugs. That's a metaphor that doesn't make any sense. Drugs don't have guns. Drugs don't have tanks. They can't fight back. So a war on drugs is just a non sequitur. It's actually a war on people who want to consume drugs. And once you think about it in those terms, then it's obvious that a bunch of other bad things are going to happen. We're going to spend a ton of money. We're probably not going to dissuade that many people from wanting to consume drugs. We're going to generate a huge black market. And in black markets, we have violence and corruption, exactly as was documented in the lead into this discussion, and as we all know about in Mexico and Latin America and Afghanistan and all sorts of other places that pursue a vigorous war on drugs.
Hey, so what do you think about that? The whole premise of the last 40 years has been wrong. What do you think?
Well, I disagree with it.
Okay.
Fundamentally, and the introduction to the program.
Okay.
You've got to be clear. If you're going to say what we've been doing is wrong, I don't mind changing the metaphor, but to reduce the seriousness of our global commitment to reducing illegal drugs, I think it's wrong. First of all, we've reduced in the past overall drug use 50%, cocaine use by 75% during the last 40 years. Whenever you look at legalization, if that's the solution to reduce the powers of the cartel, then what are you going to legalize? You can debate marijuana, but that's not going to solve a problem because they're going to be peddling in methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine. If you legalize each of those, they're going to continue to increase consumption of those, the problems in our society. And I don't think anybody really wants to legalize methamphetamine or cocaine or heroin. That's not the solution. This is a commitment to reducing illegal drugs. We've had success in that. Certainly we need to make improvements, but let's don't throw this out and say let's legalize everything.
What do you think about that, Jeffrey? What would you legalize? Would you legalize everything across the board?
I would legalize everything across the board. So let me agree with Mr. Hutchinson that just legalizing marijuana is a relatively small issue in terms of all the ancillary negatives of black markets and corruption and violence. A huge fraction of all of those negatives that we associate with the illegal drug trade, okay, are due to other drugs, not mainly to marijuana. So we really do have to have an honest conversation about all these other drugs. Where I really disagree is the view that drug prohibition is keeping the consumption of drugs substantially lower than it otherwise would be. There's just no evidence for that whatsoever. Okay? We don't have perfect evidence on that issue because very few countries have ever taken the legalization experiment. Right. But to the extent we do have evidence, it suggests very strongly that consumption of drugs would not change very much even if we were to legalize. Second, even if it goes up, and even if it goes up a lot, we have to balance whatever negatives might come from that against all the huge negatives we get by attempting to prevent that increase in use. And so it's not just a question of whether prohibition has some potential benefit in the sense of reducing drug use, if you consider that a benefit, if the prohibition has huge costs. And a claim of legalizers is that all the costs of prohibition are far worse than any possible benefit it might have from reduced use.
Okay, so if we look at this, the prohibition is more costly than legalization. That's what Jeffrey's thesis is. You obviously probably disagree with that.
Well, I do, but first of all, I applaud Jeffrey for being very honest on this and defining the debate. If you want to decrease violence or the powers of the cartel, you have to legalize everything, and I don't think that's the debate that's going to win in America or across the globe. When you look at our historical experience, though, in Alaska decriminalized marijuana in the 70s. They recriminalized it in the 90s by a vote of the people because drug usage went up. Marijuana usage went up, and there was concern for parents with their teens. And so that is a historical experience that, decriminalization did not work. And so I think that when you look at the cost of prohibition, it's another dangerous product. You want to put cocaine, heroin, increased methamphetamine use, ecstasy use, all out in the marketplace. I don't think that's the solution for America.
Jeffrey, what about prevention? Because it seems like so much money is put into fighting this with using the military. I mean, we see what the Mexicans are doing here. I mean, if we just put a lot more effort on prevention, wouldn't that be more cost effective? I mean, it really is a consumption issue at the end of the day, isn't it?
Certainly consumption is a huge part of it. Again, we have to balance that against the cost of whatever policy we adopt to try to reduce consumption. There's absolutely nothing wrong with thinking about prevention, and some kinds of preventions sort of may be somewhat effective, but I think it's misleading. It's sort of a false hope to believe that by putting lots more money into prevention, we can drastically reduce the demand for drugs and therefore not have to worry about the problem. All the evidence would suggest that while prevention is clearly beneficial for many people and treatment is obviously should be available for people who want to reduce their drug use, lots and lots of extra dollars spent on prevention are probably going to make a very minor difference to the overall demand for drugs. Rightly or wrongly, the demand for drugs, the demand for other intoxicating things like alcohol, seems to be a pervasive and persistent feature of human beings. It's just something we can't change very much. And so neither prohibition nor prevention is going to change the underlying reality that some people are going to use those substances. It's important to note, many people use them without adverse effects to themselves or others. A small fraction, of course, do use them in ways which are unfortunate for themselves or harm other people, and that's what we should be focusing on, not just the use by itself, because much use is basically innocuous.
If I can go to you, is there a middle ground here? Can we end prohibition, but still some kind of decriminalization, legalization, regulation? Is there a middle ground that we can find here? Because this report that just came out that I mentioned at the beginning of the program says that this what we call the war on drugs is an utter failure. What do we need to rethink? Because if we continue down the same path, it's just very expensive. It clogs up the judicial system. People are put in prison for using drugs. Maybe they should not be put in prison. I mean, there has to be a fundamental rethink here because it seems to just get more and more expensive, more and more violent.
I don't disagree with
in terms of a middle
fact
ground.
That we need to.
Let's go to San Diego first. Go ahead.
Yes, we need to rethink some things. That's why I support the Right on Crime initiative, which wants to reduce our incarceration rate for those that got an addiction problem, utilizing drug prevention courts where it's alternative to incarceration. Many of the states like Texas, which has high incarceration rates, are reducing them, putting more money into reentry programs, rehabilitation programs, and trying to reduce the incarceration rate. These are absolutely correct things to do. We are reducing our spending on prevention. I think we need to continue to emphasize that message that we give nationally and internationally makes a difference in consumption as well.
Jeffrey, do you want to make a quick comment on that before we go to the break?
Yeah, I just want to say I think the crucial part of finding a middle ground is that the supply side of the market, the production and sale, as well as possession, has to be legal. If you just decriminalize possession, but you still try vigorously to keep the market underground, to go after the traffickers, to go after production, you're still going to have all the corruption and violence that we currently have. So again, it's a false hope to think that we can have an easy middle ground just by decriminalizing demand side. You have to do both sides of the market.
I'm going to jump in here, gentlemen. I'm going to jump in here. Okay, Jeffrey, I'd like to go back to you and Newton. I think one of the interesting things I found researching this program is that politicians play a very big role in this policy. And, when they are up for election, everybody wants to be tough on crime, tough on drugs, tough on this, tough on everything, tough on terrorism, you just name it, tough on something. And there's not really much of a real discussion, at least in the United States, about how to deal with this growing problem, especially coming from the South. Is this one of the bottlenecks that we have in having a more blunt discussion about how to deal with drug abuse and with the drug importation into the United States?
Well, I think that the politicians are, for the most part, in both sides of the aisle, Democrats, Republicans, conservative, liberal, are not talking about this issue very much. But I think they're reflecting the views of the voters in the United States and similarly elsewhere. I agree with Mr. Hutchinson that there is not currently the desire or the will from a significant majority or even, that large a minority to legalize harder drugs like cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. And so it's not going to happen for a long, long time. It's not going to happen until or unless there's substantial change in attitudes, substantial change in understanding by the voters about what the actual evils are. My view is that the evils are coming from the policy. Many of the evils are coming from the policy, not from use per se, but that's not the widely held view. Okay, until I'm able to persuade more people, other people change their minds, hey, we're not going to see a change in politicians' behavior. They're just reflecting what voters want.
Okay, so Jeffrey, south of the border, a lot of people would say that the United States is far more concerned with security than with the consumption issue. I mean, should that be balanced out a lot more? Because a lot of those guns, I mean, I don't know all the numbers because it's illegal, but the guns come from the north and they go to the south, and that's where all this killing is happening.
It's certainly true that guns are right now coming substantially from the U.S., but it's silly to think that trying to prevent the guns from crossing the border to Mexico or further south would make a huge difference. There are lots of countries that produce guns. If we do more to interdict guns going south, there'll just be more violence related to the illegal gun trade. The fundamental fact is there's a huge demand for guns right now in Mexico because of the violence, because of the risk, and so we're not going to change that with any policy toward guns in the United States. It's only by de-escalating the war that we would have a significant difference. So go back to your point about is there any middle way? Okay? I think a very useful point, it's not my absolutely preferred policy, but a very useful thing to note is that while Mexico had drug violence before the sort of middle of 2007 when we started to see this huge escalation in Mexican drug violence, they still had prohibition, they still had some violence, but it was relatively mild. It was quite mild compared to what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. What happened that caused that was that Felipe Calderon escalated the war against the traffickers in Mexico, escalated the war against the cartels. The more policy interferes, the more it declares war against the traffickers and really tries to fight that war, the more auxiliary violence we're going to see. So if Mexico would just go back to what it was doing before 2007, not fully legalizing, but just scaling back the war, that would be highly beneficial. That would be a huge step in the right direction.
And so if I ask you, I mean, so violence begets violence here. You lower the threshold, you lower the amount of killing. Jeffrey brings up a good point there. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I understand the point, and sure, you can reduce your targeting of the cartels by the Calderon administration in Mexico, but that's not going to help long term. They have to recognize, they have recognized, they have some institutional problems in Mexico where the cartels are more powerful than law enforcement. You've got to strengthen the institution of the rule of law in Mexico, and that is the goal and what they're trying to accomplish. That doesn't happen overnight. And so the solution is not to decriminalize, to legalize, to hopefully put the cartels out of business. For one thing, the cartels are engaged in alien smuggling. And so how much are you going to legalize to try to put them out of business? Even though in Prohibition in the 1930s, you perhaps when you legalized alcohol reduced some violence, you didn't put the La Cosa Nostra, the mafia, out of business. They even continue until today. They just look for new business opportunities. And that's what the cartels in Mexico are doing and will continue to do. So the answer is not legalization, but the answer is strengthening the rule of law in Mexico.
Okay. Jeffrey, what about just taxing it all? I mean, America is a place of free markets, okay? So why don't you just make it into tobacco and into alcohol, okay? I mean, their health risks obviously related to both of them. I don't want to do that with some, not all, but most of the drugs. Just turn it into a business.
Well, tobacco in particular is a very... Tobacco is a very, very useful example. The U.S. and the world started to recognize in the early 1950s that tobacco was a much more dangerous product than had previously been recognized. We did not prohibit it or outlaw it. We engaged in all sorts of public and private public health initiatives, education initiatives, and slowly but surely, over 30, 40 years, tobacco consumption in the United States dropped enormously. The fraction of people who smoke, the amount that's being consumed, has gone down a huge amount without any prohibition, without the black markets, the violence, or any of that. So a system in which we have some sort of sin tax, in which we have regulations on minimum purchase ages, in which there are possibly sort of government funds going to help with treatment, and so that has, in my assessment, my analyses, a much, much better ratio of benefits to cost. Does it keep use absolutely at zero? Of course not. Does it prevent all use? No. But it recognizes that use has some negatives, but prohibition has some negatives. We have to balance those two things. Now, you should emphasize, we're not going to keep use at a teeny level with a big tax. If you have that big a tax, everybody's going to evade the tax, and you're just going to drive the market underground. So we can make some attempt to reduce use with moderate sin taxes, but we have to accept that legalization is likely to lead to some increase in use, not dramatic increase in uses, but that needs to be is one side of the ledger. The other side is all the negatives done by prohibition.